In this session, we will discuss the high-level overview of the Service Provider API, but to be able to understand the primary workflow, I will give you a very high-level and quick summary of the architecture for the service peer. Basically, the service peer is the primary entity which is responsible for providing services to the user. So service peer is the entity or the institution that provides different kind of services that allows the user to be able to utilize or consume or subscribe. The service peer is managed by the provider or the service provider, and also assisted by the service approver or the approver, which is responsible basically for approving all the service meant for the service tokens. At the same time, the service peer, as managed by the service provider, will have the wallet transaction capability. That means it has the facility to be able to perform wallet transactions, that is rotation cash transfer, service token transfer to the users or the user's wallet. So we provide different kind of transactions to the service provider, and the one of that is the peer management. That means the service provider has the capability to be able to manage the entire peer. That means from requesting for a credit purchase or performing a wallet transfer and everything. At the same time, we also provide a user registration facility for the service provider to be able to register a user wallet. We also have a facility for transfer or the management of rotation cash, that is from credit purchase to PayPal purchase, including the user wallet transfer. It has also the facility to be able to register a service token, which is basically the service token is a general purpose token that allows the service provider to be able to use a virtual currency from within the services that they can provide. And this is extensible and will be visible to the user's wallet. Basically, the user can make a balance inquiry or perform transaction with the service tokens balance that they have. And of course, the basic transaction is the transfer. That means service provider has the facility to be able to transfer rotation cash and service tokens to the user wallet. At the same time, it also provides a facility for the user to be able to redeem or consume the tokens for whatever kind of transactions they want to perform within the platform. That is for the high-level overview. So let's take a look at the API summary this time. In this example, we have a registered service peer in our platform with the ID Mercury. This Mercury represents the Mercury Corporation. This is a dummy corporation name. So if you will notice, we have in the registration is the service provider with the ID Mercury. At the same time, we also have the service approver with the ID Mercury approver. So this is to signify that there are two participants involved in the management of this particular entity, which we call the Mercury Corporation. So service provider, as explained in earlier, this is responsible for managing the service peer, and the service approver is responsible for the approval of all the service token mints. So in our service provider API, we have a very straightforward response and request structure. So this is the response structure. Basically, it comes with three fundamental elements, which is the code, which serves as the response code, whether the request is successful or failure. Description would be to describe whether it is successful, or it also describe whether there is a failure in the previously um, submitted transaction. At the same time, there's also the date where the response was actually sent. And of course, the most important part is the data, which gives you the service API response information. This data basically is a flexible element, so depending on the type of request, it will also vary the data elements that will be reflected on the data part. Now, to simplify the implementation, we basically use only two response codes, which is, as you can see, we have the 100, which is a positive number to imply a successful API call. And we also have the negative value, which is negative 100, which refers to an error in the service call. That means this is an application level error. That means whatever is the error, it will be shown in the data elements with the proper description. Now, if you look at our diagram, if you look at the architectural blocks, this code description data and date are actually application level response code. But on top of that, there is the server level HTTP code. So what does this mean is, first the application needs to check what is the HTTP code. For example, whether if this is error 401, that means that you are not authorized to call the API without a proper credential. That means that's you have to redirect to a login page, for example, but it doesn't really involve anything with the application yet. It's still at the HTTP level processing. So that is the first thing that you have to check. Make sure that proper HTTP code response has been processed and properly parsed. So for example, if the HTTP code is 200, that means this is a successful call. That's the time that you will go to the application level block. That means you can verify whether the code is 100 is successful, or this is a negative, or some error is happening in the response. So this is very important. So there are two layers of code as a summary. It's HTTP code, which gives you like 401 for unauthorized, and we also have the application response code, whether to signify that there is an error in your request, like maybe missing parameters or something like that. You can get all those information in the application block response. Now let's take a look at very important API, which is the authenticate. This is actually the very entry point for our API calls, since this is where you will get your access token to be able to make a service call to the rest of the API. So the foundation is you will have to be authenticated to be able to get your token, and then you will use the token to be able to call the rest of the API. Now, in our application, we use the JWT, or JSON Web Token. So we will use also the uh, header for the authorization bearer, which we will demonstrate shortly. So for the authentication, since based on our architectural diagram, there are two types of user. One is the provider and one is the approver. That's why to be able to authenticate, As you can see here in our example, you need to specify the username and then the password and then the type of the authentication you are requesting. As you can see in the notes, there are two values for the type. One is provider and the other one is the approver. This is to signify that you are logging in as a service provider or you are logging in as a service approver. And then once you initiate the code and you have been authenticated successfully, the system will respond with an access token, which is actually a JWT token or a JSON Web Token. And then we will try to demonstrate how to make the succeeding calls afterwards. But for this demonstration, let's take a look at an example of how to initiate an authentication login to the service API. So we will try to initiate a API service call. So this is basically a post request. So it's very important that based on our API documentation, you have to clarify or identify whether this is a post or this is a GET request. So basically, this authentication is a post request. That's why you have to specify that this is actually post request here. Now, as per our API documentation, there are three parameters that we need to pass. One is the username, second is the password, and of course the type, which is either a provider or an approver. So in this case, let's take, for example, I am logging in as a service provider. So we will initiate this call using the endpoint. Endpoint you can find in the documentation. So let's try to initiate this as an example. Okay, so as you can see, I received first again, as I mentioned earlier, we need to check for the HTTP response code. So in this case, as you can see, this is 200 or okay. That means the service call has been successful. And then you can actually now check. Remember, there is an exception to our data structure. Except for authentication, all the rest will follow the same code, description, and data. But the authentication will use a different format, only the authentication, because it needs to provide you with the access token. So in this case, as you can see, we have successfully been authenticated and we were given the access token, which we can actually use to initiate the other APIs, which we will demonstrate shortly. Okay, so it's very straightforward. Just specify the username, the password, and then you provide the type as whether a provider or a approver, and then you initiate the post call, and then you will get the access token upon successful authentication. Now, since we already have the access token from earlier, we have been properly authenticated. Now let's take an example service call. In this case, we wanted to register a service token. So it's very important to inspect the different information provided in the documentation. So let's go through it one by one. For example, let's start with authorization. So this is very important. You know that this particular API requires an authentication using the bearer authorization. And also, it will also indicate whether this particular API call is for provider or this is for the approver. And on the second line, you can also see that we have the request type, whether this is post or this is a GET request. So in this case, the service token registration is a post. So make sure you have specified the correct request type. Third one, which is also basically very important, is you need to be able to identify what is the correct endpoint for this API call. So in this case, we have the slash register slash token. So this is very important because otherwise you will be sending an incorrect endpoint and you will get an incorrect response. So make sure that you have the proper request type, you have the correct request endpoint also. Now, the second important thing to check in the API documentation is the request. That is the parameter that you need to send to the server, and also the response, which is the basically the data that is coming back from the server. So this is a request and response prototype. So we give you some example data so that you can be guided accordingly. So like for example, in this example, we want to register a service token. As you can see in the request row, the parameter requires four uh, parameters or arguments, which is first is the name, which you can basically name your service token. So in this case, our example, we call it my token. And you also have the symbol. You can choose whatever symbol. Typically, it's 2 characters, but if the service provider would like to use 3 or 4, it's up to them. We also have decimal, which is basically the number of decimal places for your service token. If you want to implement like 1.00 for 2 decimal places, or you can go as high as 18 decimal places, which is part of the platform restriction. We also have the fourth parameter, which is a Boolean value, which is to tell you whether the token is transferable. When we say transferable, it means whether the token is transferable from wallet to wallet. Okay? If it's false, that means user cannot basically send a token or transfer a token to another user wallet, but it doesn't affect the service peer to be able to transfer to a user wallet. This particular flag is only specific for user to user transfer. So it's up to the service provider whether they want to be able to do a user to user or wallet to wallet transfer or not. Okay, so the second row is the response. So this is an example of how does the server responds. As I mentioned earlier, we have the basic structural response block, which is the code description. We also have the date and the data. So you can basically parse this according to this data structure for all the rest of the API. But take note, except for the authentication, all API will be following the same structure. Okay, and also very important that sometimes there are side notes or explanation. That's why you also have to check the note part so that you will know some details about like what kind of parameter you need to provide, like in our authentication case, whether we have the type, whether the type is a provider or approver. Here the note just will tell you whether the transferable, what is the purpose of the transferable parameter. So whether this is a Boolean value for allowing a wallet to wallet transfer. Okay, so this is very straightforward. Just take a look at whether this is requires an authorization and who can perform this API. As you can see, this is by provider. You have to check what is the request type, whether this is a post or get. You have to verify also which URL or endpoint I need to send this request, and also what is the proper parameters that needs to be passed, and also an example of what would be the response coming from the server. So these are the most important things you need to check before you implement your API calls. Okay, so let's take a look at an example of how to initiate the API calls using this particular information. Now let's make a sample call how to register a service token using the provided information from the documentation. So in this case, remember, there are several things that we need to check. First is the request type, which is post. So make sure that you have the correct request type. You need to check is the endpoint, as we have explained earlier. So this is the slash register slash token. Second is the authorization. We go, since it's a better authorization, we go to the header. Make sure that you specify here in the header authorization, and the value is the better plus the token, the access token that you get from the authentication. So in this case, we can check. As you can see here, we have some data, this is exactly the data from the authentication that we performed earlier. And remember, in the documentation, it specified that this transaction can only be performed the provider. That's why make sure that you get the provider token. So as you can see here, it's coming from the authentication provider, and it provides you the token value here. So it's authorization, again, authorization. You provide the bearer type, and then after the bearer, you provide the access token accordingly. So again, you have to specify the correct endpoint here. You have to specify the request type, which is post. You have to specify the correct authorization, and also you have to specify who can perform this transaction. That's why this particular token has been authenticated as a provider. And most important thing is you provide the parameter for this request. So as in our example, in this case, let's say since we are using the Mercury Corporation as an example, so I specify here first is the name, and we have the symbol, which is empty. M for Mercury and T for token, just a dummy name. And then we also specify the value of 2 for the decimal. That means it can support 1.11 or 1.50 with the 2 decimal places after. And of course, the last parameter is transferable, whether we allow user to user or wallet to wallet transfer. In this case, let's just say I don't want it to be user or wallet transferable, so I make it a false. Okay, so you have now all the parameters, all the required parameters to be able to make the API call based on the information provided in the API documentation. So let's say, for example, we want to execute this. Okay, so as you can see here, again, just like our normal protocol, first check for the HTTP code. 200 means successful, and then remember we have the basic structure for the response: code, description, date, and data. So first check whether the response code is 100 or negative 100. Negative 100 means error, 100 positive 100 means successful. So it's also giving you the description success. This is the date that the token has been registered, and now we have the data also representing the token symbol. So it's very straightforward. We have the request. Make sure you follow what is reflected in the API documentation. And we also have the response based on our response code structure. So it's very straightforward to use. All you have to do is just follow exactly what is described in the API documentation. Now let's take a look at one more example for the API call. But basically, all of them will just basically follow the same instruction as I explained earlier. But just to give you a more concrete example, let's give one more. example for like let's say for example, let's take a look at the register user. So this is an API that allows you to register a user and be able to register a user wallet accordingly. Now in this example, there are two types of user registration. One is the minimum and one is the what we call the expanded. This is a little bit flexible registration. So just like in our example earlier, first you need to check the authorization. So as you can see, this also shows the bearer. We also have the request type. Again, it's a post and the endpoint. Now, one very interesting to take a note here is that both the register user minimum and the register user expanded have the same endpoint. The reason why, because the API is flexible to accept minimum data and it can also accept the expanded data. So I will provide a very quick instruction. So for example, in the user registration for minimum, the API allows you to be able to register a specific user using only very simple parameter, which is the ID or your user ID, your name, which is your full name, and password. So you only require three parameters. Basic parameter, just the name, user ID or your username that you want to use, and then the password. Okay, but on the other hand, if you want to have a much more detailed user profile, you can also register using the expanded format. So let's try to take a look at. So here, aside from you have the user ID, you also have the password, you also have the name. You can also add more information. For example, we have the gender, we have the nationality, we have the birth date, we have the contact, which is an email, phone, or the mobile number, you have the address. You can do that using the same endpoint with more expanded information. Okay, so it's either you want to invoke the minimum, same endpoint, same API call, or you can use the expanded format and just follow the example provided. Okay, so you have authorization, you have the request type, you have the endpoint, you have the sample request format structure, and as usual, you have the standard response structural block, which is a code, description, date, and data. Okay. Now let's take a look at the sample API calls. So just like in previous example, first we have to check the request type here. This is a post request. We have to specify the endpoint, which is a /register/user. We have to check also for the authorization. So we go to header, the same format. We have the authorization, we have the bearer, and we also have the access token. And make sure that the access token is coming from the authentication provider, because this API call is only specific for the service provider. Okay, so the same workflow. Check for the request type, check for the endpoint, check for the authentication header, and then finally check for the parameters. So in this case, we are taking an example for a user registration with minimal requirements or minimum requirements. So what is required is you only need to specify the ID or the user ID, name, and of course the password. So in this case, we will try to register the specific user and let's try to initiate the call. Okay, so just like in earlier example, we have to check for the HTTP code. Right now it's 200, that means API call is successful. Then check for this, our standard response structural block, which is code response is 100 to identify successful. Description is success. You have date and the data. So it's the same fundamental request response workflow. Now for example, let's try to initiate the similar API call but with the expanded parameters. So in this case, let's try to take a look at another example here. Again, just like in earlier explanation, first you have to check for your request type, post, endpoint, authorization, token, and make sure that whoever is the participant, whether it's provider or the approver, it should provide the correct token for the user. Okay. And at the same time, let's check for the parameters for the request. So in this case, if you can see, now we have an expanded information. We have the address, we have the email, phone, birth date. Similarly, this is more of a JSON structural layout. But just want to give you an idea how does it look like, because all the request and response is in JSON format. So I'll show you here. As you can see, it follows just a very straightforward JSON list structure. Don't worry, because this particular format is also given in the API documentation. So you will be guided with an example data there. Okay. So now we will try to initiate the same API call with an expanded information for user registration. So let's try to initiate. Okay, so this is successful. Again, the usual workflow is check for HTTP code. Right now, this is 200. Check for the application response code 100, which is successful. And then we also have the description, date, and data to signify whatever information that you can get. Okay, so again, just like all the rest of the API, you will be following the same workflow. Just to summarize, first check for the request type, check for the endpoint or the URL, check for the authentication type, which is normally it's bearer type. Make sure that you have the correct token for a specific user that is required. Make sure that also you have the correct parameters, which is as per the given example in the API documentation. And once you get the response, make sure that to check first the HTTP code, check the application response code, and then you can get also all the other information accordingly based on our standard response structure block. Okay, so the rest of the API will just basically follow the same standard. We have provided examples of the response, what are the parameters that you need to specify, and what are the information that you will get from the response. It's documented in there. So I think the rest of the APIs will follow the same workflow. So I hope it's very easy. I hope it's very straightforward to learn how to initiate the call to the service provider API. In case you have some question, just contact us in Skype or send us an email. Okay, so thank you very much, and just let us know if you have some more questions. Thank you.